So again, thanks so much for joining us. This is Lucas Rockwood with Yoga Body Naturals, and I'm really happy to be joined by Kimberly Johnson today. And Kimberly is American, and she lives in Brazil, and I am in Spain, so we have a whole bunch of thousands of miles between us. And Kimberly also has a really bad sinus infection, so she's really going the extra mile today to be here with us. She doesn't have much of a voice, but the voice that she does have is going to give quite a bit of insight. So thanks so much for joining us, Kimberly.
Thanks, Lucas.
Well, great. So the whole purpose of this webinar is called How's Your Spine? And let me just, before we get into anything, let me tell you why we're doing this webinar, because it kind of came out of the blue, and we've just had literally almost 1,000 people have signed up for this webinar, so we've got a whole bunch of people listening, so much interest. So I want to tell you why we did this webinar in the first place, so you understand what this is all about. You may or may not know this, but I'm personally the single biggest yoga training event producer in the world. And what that means is that I host and produce more live courses each year than any other yoga teacher on the planet. I do most of these in Thailand. And the reason I'm telling you this is because it means that I get to work with some really amazing teachers, oftentimes teachers that people haven't heard of, but teachers who have some specialties and some deep knowledge that can really give you great insight into your practice. So that's why we're doing this. And I've been working with Kimberly Johnson now for a couple of years. She's kind of one of my secret weapon teachers. She knows so much. She's like an encyclopedia of knowledge when it comes to yoga poses, functional anatomy, and how this stuff really works on a physical level. And I just find that yoga students, after even a few months or at least after a year of practice, they get so interested in understanding their poses on a deeper level. And this is what Kimberly is really great at. So she and I are about 2 weeks away from starting our first ever Yoga for Back and Neck Care virtual workshop. And once it starts, it's going to completely absorb both of our lives for a solid 5 weeks. And so before we started that course, we're both just so excited about this material. The course is going to be awesome, by the way, but we both agreed it'd be really fun to do an open format, free course. We just invite everybody to give them some valuable information where we can take a look at the spinal alignment of a bunch of real students, yoga body students, so that everyone can join us for at least this first class. And like I said, we got overwhelmed with photos. I just got more photos than I could really handle, but we've got quite a few good selection and diversity of postures that we're going to look at today. Again, if we didn't get to your photo and you sent one in, I'm really sorry. We'll figure out a way to get back to you personally, and what I think you'll find actually is going through this webinar, you'll be able to compare your photos to the photos of some other people we're using, and you'll be able to get some really great insights. So we're going to take a look at the photos and the spinal alignment of real people. These are Yoga Body subscribers who are kind enough to send in their photos, and trust me, you're going to learn a lot from this. So a little important disclaimer before we get started here. The first one is that perfect posture doesn't exist. And what I mean by that is there is no such thing as a perfect spine or a perfect posture. Perfection in the body, it doesn't exist. We're naturally imbalanced in all regards. If we're right-handed, our right arm is stronger than our left arm. If we're left-handed, the opposite is true. Our hips are never quite balanced. And the practice of yoga is all about moving towards balance. And the reason I mention this right up front is because we're going to look at a bunch of postures, and we're going to talk about ways that could be improved, ways to avoid injury, ways to find more spinal alignment. But it's just important to remember that there's nothing wrong with you right now. There's nothing wrong with your body, and this isn't about striving for perfection. Yoga is not about perfection. It's about moving towards balance. It's finding more balance in our body, more balance in our mind, and our stress in our life, and more lifestyle balance as well. So I just want to make that disclaimer right up front. And last but not least, if you've got back pain, if you're suffering from a chronic back or neck pain, the smart thing to do is see a professional. The even smarter thing to do is see about 3 professionals, because you probably get bad advice from at least a couple of them. And do get professional advice. I mean, I'm the king of self-treatment and at-home care, but the advice of professionals will at least help you understand what you don't understand. So for sure, if you're suffering from chronic lower back or neck pain, make sure you're working with a professional locally or virtually, and get some professional help as well. The purpose of this is to give you knowledge and tools so you can make smart choices. Whether you're a yoga student, whether you're a back pain sufferer, whether you're a yoga teacher, you can help understand your body and your spine better to make smarter, more informed choices as you move forward. So here's the deal. Yoga practice is really all about the spine. We talk about flexibility. we talk about alignment in a posture, we talk about core strength, or we talk about balance. These are all really different ways to talk about the same thing. We're really talking about the integrity of your spine in a posture. So with that said, let's get right into it. I'll turn it over to you, Kimberly, and again, just a big thanks to Kimberly for joining us today. She's really lost her voice, but she's really going the extra mile for us. So thanks, Kimberly. Let's talk about the line.
Thank you, and thank everybody for your patience for this voice. Just so you know, Lucas, I'm not seeing your open screen, but I have my copy, so I won't know when you're clicking through.
Okay.
Okay, so this picture here of the line is to show that when the segments of the body are not in alignment, the gravitational force really pulls us down. And when they are in alignment, there's actually a sense of lift. So even though as humans, like you said, there's not one good posture, there's a variety of postures that all are functional. But there's also some basic geometric principles that we can use so we can understand our own posture. So if these segments aren't stacked up, then there's going to be pain at the areas where you see that there's misalignment. And so when we're looking at these pictures, hopefully, that everyone here will recognize themselves a little bit in each of the people who were kind enough to send in their photos. So I'll just reinforce what you said, that there's really no perfect posture, there's just functional posture, but that we can apply both this geometrical lens and also an aesthetic lens. And hopefully, the more that we look at these together, the more that you refine your own vision. And I know I take this for granted because I had a friend helping me do the Photoshop to put in the lines, and he's a yoga teacher, and even so, what I was seeing wasn't exactly what he would normally call his attention to. So hopefully I'll be able to call your attention to some things so that the people who sent in their pictures will be able to notice, but that you also will be able to see in the future where those points of tension, sometimes weakness, sometimes overly strong are, so that there can be an overall sense of balance and we can deal with this back and neck pain and wherever else the imbalance happens to be showing itself.
Well, great. So, Kimberly, I'm looking at the photo of the line here, and this is a really simple illustration of spinal alignment. And can you know, I mean, obviously, we've all seen someone who has very hunched shoulders. We've seen someone who has a very swayed back or very tilted pelvis. Can you just give us an idea about, what are we looking at here when we look at the illustration on the left versus the illustration on the right, and what can people take away from this?
On the left, you're seeing someone with a forward head position, which is really common just because most people are driving, sitting at a computer so often. And then you're seeing somebody here who has both an excessive lumbar curve, which you can see by it. So the top square is the head, the little one is the neck, the following one is the chest, the following one is the waistline, next one's the pelvis. So you're looking between where the smaller square in the middle and then the rectangle. On the right you see that rectangle is parallel to the floor. On the left you see that it's a slight declining slope, which is pretty common. I come from a Rolfing perspective. This model is actually a Rolfing model, which is a kind of bodywork, and basically the objective of the technique among many is horizontalizing the pelvis. A horizontal pelvis is this pelvis on the right, where the pelvic block is parallel to the floor. So I think that this model will make sense once we look at actual people, but just so that you can tell, this person's head is going forward and is actually slightly tilted down. Whatever's happening in one part of the spine is going to reflect in all the other parts. So there's no such thing as a forward head position and the rest of your spine is doing great. Because if the head is forward, something else in the spine has to go back, and something else in the spine has to go forward. That's the only way that it can remain upright. Imagine if you had this whole stack of blocks on the right, but the head was forward. It can't happen. There has to be something that's counterbalancing it.
Well, great.
Does
With
that
that,
make sense?
yeah, absolutely. So with that, let's jump to the next slide, which is connecting the dots, which gives us a little bit of a closer illustration of exactly this. I mean, can you help us understand? So we looked at that hip block, and I think for a lot of people, if they just look at themselves in the mirror in a profile, they're going to discover that their hip block is not horizontal. They're either going to be tilting forward or, less common, tilting back. So can we take a look at now connecting the dots where each of these different lines people can address?
Yes. So here you have the major joint segments in the body. And when we look at a line, we're looking at stacking the center of the major joint segments. So I like this particular drawing because this woman is actually a little bit curvaceous, because sometimes when you look at these line drawings, they show people that they're just like really skinny and really flat, so it's kind of hard to tell. But here you can see that some of her calf is behind the line, some of her thigh is in front of the line, some of her buttocks is behind. It gives a little bit more of a realistic picture. So basically we're looking at the center of the ear lining up over the center of the shoulder. If you were to look at the misaligned black blocks from the slide before, obviously that ear would be way forward because of how the head was situated. But here, the ear, the center of the ear, the center of the shoulder, the center of the hip joint, the center of the knee, and the center of the ankle are aligned. So that's a really good way because, excuse me, you can look at your own profile this way. Now, when you look at your own profile, you don't want to assume military posture and then look at it. You have to be in a relaxed stance and then perhaps have somebody else take a picture of your profile so that you can check out how your own joint centers are stacking.
Great. So with that, should we jump to the first set of pictures, Kimberly? I'm looking at your spine with a picture of a woman on the left and a man on the right.
Okay, great. Yeah, on the left, I put in 2 lines. So I'm just going to try to guide you to understand how I see. So the green line on the left is a vertical line, but instead of starting at his head, I started at his ankle and went up. Because if I would have started at his head, the line would have fallen way in front. So I wanted you to see the second line is me superimposing the center of the joint segments, and you can see that it's on a forward slant, right? I think that's pretty obvious, right?
Very much so.
If you look at the connection, between the center of the ankle and the center of the ear, I put that line in, and you can see that he's tilted way forward. The other thing that I put in here is the blue line is the angle of his pelvis. So, like we looked at the black and yellow joint segments of the line, we would like a horizontal pelvis, and his pelvis is at quite a steep tilt. So, because his head is quite a bit forward, and his pelvis here is at quite a steep tilt, it's pretty likely that he's having some tension in his spinal muscles. On the right, is it okay if I use these people's names or no?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so she's Corey on the right. If you look at her joint segments, everything's pretty well stacked. If you started at the top, hit her ear and went down, her ear's pretty much over her shoulder. It's a little forward, but not much, which is pretty much over the center of her hip, the center of her knee. Her ankle joints are pretty far back. I'm guessing from this picture that she's a runner, just because of the overall level of muscle tension, and also because she's very erector. Erectors are the muscles in the back of the body. In this position, she's if you were going to choose between flexors and erector preference, she's really more towards erectors. And because you'll see some more pictures of her, but looking at the other pictures, my guess is that she's a runner because she has a pretty even overall level of muscle tone. There's not one part of her body that's extremely stiff and another part that's really loose. It's kind of uniform. So, yeah, and she has, her pelvis is fairly horizontal. It's not totally horizontal, but in the huge scheme of variation, it's fairly horizontal. So I wanted to put in, these next slides are examples of different postural variation. In addition to just looking at the joint stacking, there's one other thing that I'd like to call your attention to. It's just where the arms are and how much of the body you can see behind the arms and how much you can see in front of the arms. And you can see that from her elbow, you can hardly see anything behind her arms. Her whole waist is in front of her arms. And you'll see some more examples as we go along. So you can go ahead to the next slide.
Okay, I'm piked at the hips.
Okay. I feel like visually this one was a little harder for me to represent, but I can tell, this is Allison, that she's piked at her hips, so you'll see a vertical line from the leg to the hip and then a slightly pitched forward. So our friend, it was the first guy that we looked at, I believe his name is Fred, he was just entirely forward on his line. It was a steady forward diagonal. But Allison is actually upright to the leg, but at the hip she's piked forward. So for her, she's really going to need to do a lot of lunging movements, which we cover in weeks 1 and 2 in our course, modules 1 and 2. I also think that she probably has a fair amount of mid-back tension because she's very flat in her thoracic. And even though there's variations in spinal curves, overall we do need a little bit of curvature, and that's what you saw in Fred too, that it was very flat, the flat surface. And in her spine, even though it's pitched forward, you also see that there's a kind of flat. I know that if I saw her skin, it would be very taut. And that's independent of body weight. She's also a larger breasted woman, which puts a heavier load on the upper back. So her head has to work harder to stay upright. But the major thing that I wanted to point out there was that it's as if she's bending over all the time, the way that she's standing.
And so, Kimberly, when we look at somebody like this who has, say, a less functional line than someone else, is it fair to say that they could have more spine problems, but they could have no spine problems as well, right? Just because their line is not as functional doesn't necessarily mean. Yeah.
Exactly. Corey could have more pain than Allison. It's not really a pain indicator.
Right.
But it could be how we use our bodies. And you can say that overall, to be completely honest, I'm not surprised that often when people come to me and they describe their level of symptomology. It usually matches their deviation from center or overall level of muscle tone, but it's definitely not a one-to-one correlation.
Yeah, I find that the more people learn about their own spine and their own tendencies, the more they learn how to be careful with their body, especially in yoga practices or weight-bearing practices like lifting weights, or during impact athletic exercises like running or skipping rope or anything like this. And so a lot of this, just because you might not have the most functional looking spine, you might have a very functional physical practice. Like you might know how to work with your own body. Is that fair to say?
Definitely. Yeah.
Well, great. Should we jump to the next slide?
Yes.
So we're looking at zigzag here.
Okay. This is a good example. His spine is very, I call it a zigzag because it's kind of an S shape. I hope you can see, he sent it with he's in the mirror, and so I put an arrow to the part of his waist in the mirror. Are you seeing that?
Yeah, we can see it very well.
Yeah, okay. So he has what's typically called a kyphosis lordosis, and it's very evenly distributed. So his thoracic spine is upper back, his back, and his lumbar spine is forward. So we haven't seen that pattern yet. We've seen somebody who's completely leaning forward. We've seen somebody who's piked at their hips, but we haven't seen this more exaggerated S-curve.
And from this, what can we conclude?
Well, he has a pretty steep lumbar slope. It's not as steep as the first one that we saw with
a.m.
But it's still relatively steep. But from what I can tell from his picture, I would assume that he's like a perfect candidate for a regular focused practice, because there's not a concentration of tension in any one area. It's just that those curves are exaggerated.
Okay.
So just a focus, even just a focused breathing practice on really lengthening the chest on inhalations and engaging the belly on exhalations is already going to address that imbalance.
Well, great. From here, should we jump to the next slide?
Sure.
Okay, so we're looking at hinging forward at the hips. This is a really common one that I see in yoga classes as well.
Yeah, I was kind of excited about this one because it so perfectly illustrates a common pattern, and I think I was excited about the lines I was able to draw in too, because you can see how there is a line from her ear to her ankle. It's just that everything in her body is in front of it except for those 2 points. So basically that, and if you were to draw a line horizontally at her pelvis looks pretty horizontal, don't you think?
Definitely.
Yeah. So, but there's nothing behind her arms, so that's already telling you that she needs a waist. Not that she doesn't have a waistline, but in Rolfing we call it get your waistline back. So, even though her pelvis is horizontal, which we were using as an indicator of strain in the lower back, in her case, I'm sure there's a whole lot of strain in her lower back because of the way that she's sitting her hips forward.
So
one thing that she did write on her, she titled one of her photos Scoliosis, Catherine's Scoliosis. And you can't see the scoliosis from this point of view, although I already suspected it, because a lot of times if you have a scoliotic pattern, the tendency is to lock down in the hips, and that's exactly what we don't want to do. We want to keep the hips mobile so that the spine can move. And so a lot of people do this posture because they have lower back pain, and then they think the best way to protect it is to tuck their pelvis and push it forward. And that might provide some immediate relief, but in the long term that actually causes a whole lot of other sequence of patterns that you have to unravel.
Sure. So someone with a posture similar to this could possibly be putting undue stress on their spine at any given time. Is that right? Because even in this position, her spine is not stacked, right?
No, her knee block, her pelvic block, and her chest block are all forward. And so I'm using that principle that we talked about before of something else having to be back. You can see how she's kind of hyperextending at her knee joints. That's a pretty common response to the pelvis going forward. And then her uppermost thoracic is back. And probably some of her cervicals are back even though her head is forward, because something has to go back to counterbalance the pelvis being forward. Are you there?
Yeah, sorry, I lost you for 1 second. Should we jump to the next slide?
Sure. Did you get most of what I said?
I got everything, yeah. So I'm looking now at functional line. We're back at the functional line.
Okay, so I think I covered it before. It was just when we first introduced the spines, I wanted everyone to be able to see that there's not a right and a wrong, and that we're working with all different kinds of people with all variations. But just to call attention one more time after having seen the other photos, we haven't really talked about the angle of the neck, but also because I felt like it was very generous for people to send in their pictures. The people who did, I wanted to give them input that hopefully they can use somehow. I just think she has a lot of resting level tension in her neck, based on the way she's carrying her head, which this happens a lot with yoga practitioners, is this whole idea that you have to keep your chin down and lift the back of your head all the time. And overdoing shoulder stands can flatten the neck and then make people be actually weak in the cervical spinal erectors, the muscles that go along your neck and your along parallel of your neck. So anyway, in her posture overall, I would like to see more of her waistline behind her arms, and then I would just say that she could really use a focused neck practice.
Yeah, you know, of all the photos we've looked at today so far, I mean, this person, for me anyway, looks like she's the most comfortable in her spine. I don't know if that's necessarily true or not, but she looks more balanced. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, on the continuum so far, she's the one who has the most functional life.
Great. So now I'm on the slide, not always the whole story, and we're looking at a gentleman in a standing position here.
Okay. So I loved this series of Aiden's. You can see here that he has a pretty nice vertical line if you're just looking at the joint stacking. This is where we get into some nuances in the reason why just drawing a vertical line in a picture is not necessarily going to teach you everything that you need to know. You can see that in this picture, if you draw in the horizontal at the pelvis, it's a slightly downward slope. You can also see that he's more of a zigzag shape. He has more curves in his spine than the other people that we've looked at. But overall, looking at this picture, if I wasn't looking at it with you and you just drew the line in, you'd probably think that Aiden was in pretty good shape. He has some waistline behind his arms. He has an overall level of muscle tone. I think that there's a high level of resting muscle tension. But let's go to the next slide so I can complete the story.
Good. We're here now at a different picture.
Right. So this is the same guy, and what you can basically tell is that he has an idea of what good posture is, and he was able to act that out on the slide before. So it's a long story about the history of how posture has been invented, and it's closely related to the military. So you can see that the slide before, he knows how to pull his spine up straight and tall and get into that line. But knowing how to do it and just your body automatically doing that, coming to a resting level of balance is totally different, because for him to pull himself into that position took a whole lot of effort. And you can see that because now he's sitting, and you see how far forward his head is from his shoulder. And you see that steep line from his mid-back forward. So, his hips, they're not incredibly tight. They're not super open, but I'd say that's a pretty average sitting position. Of course, when you're sitting, that puts more of a demand on your spine, because if your hips aren't open and your spine has to compensate, if you see any baby sitting, their spine is super straight, but what always calls my attention is that their knees are always on the floor. So their hips are just flopped open, which is why their spine can be completely upright. Not to mention that most babies haven't had any major physical trauma yet. And that could be, falling off your bike out of a tree, all the way to a car accident or something more severe, that all affects how we hold ourselves. So anyways, this picture, the seated picture, thankfully he sent this because I can see more, and so can you, more clearly what's actually the state of his spine.
And so in this case, in the case of Aiden, he could really benefit from some hip openers perhaps, right? And to help his seated posture, to help him get that functional line back, not just in a standing position where he has more leverage and he has more to work with, but if his hips are more open, perhaps he could find that same functional line in a seated position?
Yeah, but you know what? I don't know. I think the graphic designer might have edited out that I got a little bit of an unfair advantage here because the picture Aiden sent had a guitar and what looks like maybe a bass guitar in the background. And so that tells me that he needs to really open his upper back and his chest, because playing a guitar makes you, it's like holding a baby. It makes you really curved and rounded, and you get your head forward and you look down a lot.
Sure.
And so he can really benefit from all of the shoulder, armpit openers, and yeah, but yeah, I agree he can use, but I feel like if he just sat up on a prop, that would already help out with his legs.
Sure.
And then we really need to help him with his arms and his shoulders and head.
It's a really great insight. You know, a whole lot of what this is all about is just what we said, just discovering what's going on in your own life that's creating imbalances. Because at any given time, we're either moving toward balance or moving out of balance. And we tend to be moving out of balance unless we're doing something actively to correct it, like a very specific yoga practice, working with a body worker like Kimberly, or doing something else to correct things. But the guitar player is a great example. Another one is I used to teach quite a few flight attendants on airplanes, and just inevitably their upper back and shoulders, I mean, it was as predictable as, you know, the sunshine in the morning. I mean, their upper back and shoulders are just always locked up from walking around in small spaces carrying trays of food all day. So, you know, there's the obvious ones like working on a keyboard, which all of us end up doing, and driving cars and things like this. Then there's other things that we might be doing, whether it's playing guitar, whether it's an asymmetrical strength practice, like someone who plays tennis or even a golf swing, or something like a workplace imbalance that you might be getting from carrying trays at a restaurant, from stacking books at a library, whatever it is you do with your time. We're always either moving toward imbalance or moving toward balance. So I think that's really great that you picked up on the guitar in the background. Should we jump to the next slide, Kimberly?
Yeah.
So I'm looking at sense of up. And this is another very comfortable looking spine, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, this is Sean, and I left this one for the last one just because of all the pictures that I got. I think this one shows the most level of ease, and the only thing that I couldn't tell is that I feel like maybe the picture wasn't taken exactly from the profile perspective. Maybe it's the picture taker was a little to the left. So I can't be 100% sure of my observation. But in this posture, what I really see is a sense of up. I see that lift that we saw the first slide with the line at the hook at the top with the blocks one over the other. You saw that somehow there was some lift here. His neck looks really free. His ankles are slightly behind the line, like you see. But overall, there's waistline behind the arm, and his pelvis is fairly horizontal, and he looks like he's probably pretty comfortable in his body.
I guess what happens is with some people's posture, you can look at him and you could just take a yellow highlighter and you could just say, that's probably where there's a hot spot in your spine. And with him, like you said, I don't really see one, so it looks like a really comfortable spine. And is that where you get that sense of up, or do you mean from a lift in the heart as well, just in terms of the language?
No, I mean from the top of the head.
Right.
Like the crown of the head.
Crown of the head. Crown of the head, sure.
It looks like there's a sense of lift.
Sure.
I mean, if he's a yoga practitioner, which I am kind of thinking he is, there's definitely things that I can see that might be directions like I have a feeling that he really prefers, his body naturally prefers external rotation, especially on that right leg. It looks like he needs to work way more inner rotation at the femur heads. And I wouldn't be surprised if the lotus postures were difficult, if he was feeling some knee strain in those. But just overall, it looks like a well cared for spine.
Well, great. You know, we've got a couple of questions that I think are really relevant. Connie's asking, previous photo we looked at, you spoke about a piked, you talked about somebody piked at the pelvis. Can you explain what you mean by piked?
Okay, I guess another word I could say is hinge. So if somebody, imagine that you had a child who was the level of your hips and they came up and ran into you right at your pelvis. You would break at your hips and your spine would go forward. Or if you entered a stream that was like thigh height and it pushed you back, that's what I see in Allison's posture. So a space that should be totally vertical is actually at a forward angle, which means that basically her hip flexors and her psoas muscle are constantly not extended. They're constantly flexed.
Sure. Great. You know,
I don't know whether pike is kind of if this person's not an English speaker too. Pike is a weird word to translate. I've never found the right word in Portuguese either. It's like a pike is when you dive off the diving board and you touch your toes to your hands. You know, you fold your body in half at your hips. Is a piking action.
It's like some V formation, right? The angle can change, but it's a hinge, a V hinge. You know, I just got a message from Sean, who's the Sense of Up photo that we're looking at, and he says that his knees do hurt in Lotus, and he has an old right knee injury. So he says you were right on with your comments there.
Okay.
Well, great. So now I'm on the slide talking about forward bends, and
then he should. Then it's good that I was right on, but then we'll have to figure out how to take that to some actual healing potential.
Sure.
Because I mean, great that my observation is good, but it'd be good if I could actually help him.
Sure, of course. Well, great. So I'm looking at the slide here, forward bends, and it says, what is bending and where? Hips, low back, and neck. Can we talk about that?
Okay, this is kind of related to the piking question. So everyone's going to need to kind of change their lens a little bit now because we're going to look at a different position. Bending over, something that we have to do all the time. We all have to bend over. We can't avoid it. So whether you have a new baby and you have to bend over and pick it up, whether it's the infamous picking up a heavy box, tying shoes, whatever it is, we have to bend over. There's certain things we do in yoga practice, like, you know, eventually put your leg behind your head or even do lotus. Those are not necessary things to do. We don't have to do them. We choose to do them. But bending over, we have to do it. So in order to take care of ourselves, we have to figure out how to do that in a way that's functional, that works. And just in case I forget to say this later, just if you're listening, please do not use bending over as an excuse to get a stretch. Just stretch when you're stretching, because bending over to like tie your shoes isn't a good time to try to get a stretch. People hurt themselves a lot doing that. So what we're going to look at here is, where is your spine bending? Is it your spine that's bending, or is it your pelvis that's revolving? What is the angle of your sacrum? Your sacrum is a triangular bone at the base of your spine, and the angle of it is a good indicator of how much your pelvis is rotating around your thighs, because we want it to rotate. And then the last thing that's a little more subtle, and I know some people listening are yoga teachers and do have more experience looking at bodies, and you know, some people will just be able to see is the evenness of the curve overall of the bent. So those are the three, mostly what we'll be looking at.
So I'm looking at fold at the mid-back, the slide with 3 photos.
Okay, so I just wanted to group some things together that are a common pattern. The 2 on the left, Allison and I believe that's Fred, their forward bend is really similar. It looks like you could, have a cup of tea on their back. It's like a tray.
Mm.
And then where they fold is at their mid-back, basically, just like the title of the slide. Corey, our friend who's on the right, she has more evenness of a curve, but actually she's even less flat than Allison or Fred. And you can see that most of her curve is at that same place in the, I call that like, it's a little bit, that's like the T8 to T10 area, thoracic 8 to thoracic 10.
Mm.
It's where, it's not exactly the hinge between the lumbar and the thoracic. It's a little bit above that. And that's where they're all bending. And you can just see that Allison's able to drop her head. Corey's able to drop her head. They're all trying to do this with straight legs because we all have this idea that we want to touch our toes. And we want our legs to be straight and touch our toes. And but Fred's having a real hard time relaxing his neck, which makes me know that it's probably a very uncomfortable position for him.
And Kimberly, what would happen here? We ask people to do this with straight legs, and what happens here when people do something that's less common but often very helpful, like bend their knees? What would happen here in terms of the fold at the mid-back? How is that going to affect this posture?
Okay, so you're going to see that a little later in the slides, but if you look at the line in their lower back, I hate using the word lower back because we always say low back pain, and low back pain can mean anything from like a buttock pain to, the mid-back or whatever. But anyways, so the flat portion here, if they bent their knees, the flat portion would go on a downward sloping diagonal.
Sure.
And what that means is that their pelvis would actually rotate on their thighs, which is what we want.
Mm.
Basically, not to be overly dramatic, but any of these positions could cause a herniated disc if it was done repetitively.
Like if somebody was in the park bouncing up and down, like you often see people doing, right?
Yeah, or if any of these people sat down and then pulled as hard as they could on their feet to try to fold forward over their legs,
sure,
they could herniate a disc or bulge a disc.
Sure.
Because the spine just doesn't appreciate being in this position. Because the point of this posture is to open the whole back surface of the body. But all they're doing, I bet all any of them are feeling is the area behind their knees burning like crazy, and probably their hamstrings burning.
Yeah.
And we would want them to feel their calves, their hamstrings, the back of their knees, but also their pelvis and also their back.
Sure. Well, good. I'm looking at the next slide, evenness of the spinal curve, and we're looking at Aiden again here.
Okay, so he has a little bit more of a downward slope. So if we're putting things on like a gradient, if we're saying like, so we have these 3 spines that are folding at the mid-back, and then this one's moving in the direction of more rotation. It's not a lot, but it's a little bit more. But just so you know, Lucas, this picture was also what made me think like his hip opening wasn't so crucial as the upper back. Because when I saw this, I'm like, okay, well, he does have some turn there, so it's not as like dire of a situation.
Sure.
I mean, I could use a lot of hip opening too, and I can fold forward, so we can all use it. But his hinge is happening higher up in the spine. Not that much higher, but a little bit higher. I don't know if you can see that. But what's incredible about this picture is that if we rotated it and he was sitting down, that line would be exactly the same as the one where he was sitting. Exactly.
Mm.
It's like that area right there for him, which is like maybe T7 to T10 is just totally locked up.
Sure.
And it's not just because of the position, because it's every position he's in except for the standing where he really pulled those shoulders back to get it in. It's apparent.
Well, great. Now I'm looking at angle of the pelvis and the big question, which I see a whole bunch of people are typing in the question box as well. They're saying, what is ideal? So we're looking at all these different situations, but what are we really looking for?
Okay, so my friend on the left here, I didn't get a chance to draw in the line, but he's the only person so far that we've seen that has an ascending angle, right?
Right.
So his pelvis his angle of the tilt is, let's say, greater than 90 degrees.
Yeah.
The first slide we had 3 people that were at 90 degrees. Then Aiden was a little bit less. And then Dina here on the right, who is like a Gumby, right? Hers is like probably, I don't know, let's say 30 degrees or 25 degrees?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm just going to go ahead and say that there's an ideal, but again, it's totally, it has to be a range of ideal because there's no ideal. And we can't force ourselves into the ideal. It's a progression. But I would not be surprised if both of these people had back pain. And I think most people would say, okay, yeah, our friend on the left, he's stiff, so I bet he has pain, but she's really flexible, so I bet she feels great in her body. A 45-degree turn is probably optimal, so a little bit less than what Dina has. But somebody like her, who's like a pancake, right? She's just completely flat. She's totally hugged in. There's no more space for her to go.
Yeah.
Maybe she could lengthen out her thoracic a little bit more, but she's pretty much there. She probably needs more core and pelvic strength and more integrity in her ligaments.
Sure.
Which is like what we talk about in module 4 of our course. Our friend on the left, he needs to just start by opening his hamstrings and his hips, but which we deal with in several modules, specifically module 2 and module 5. But he's going to benefit from just general movement because there's an overall tightness in the connective tissue that once any layer of that connective tissue is opened, the other parts of the body will receive the benefits. But also, this kind of pose is not a good pose for him unless he did it with really, really bent knees. He needs to do things that are targeted for the hamstrings and the pelvis but don't load the spine at all.
Right. Explain that term for people who haven't heard that before, loading the spine. What does that mean?
Well, if you lie down on the ground, you don't have your back doesn't need to do anything to be there. You're supported by gravity. But in this position, for him particularly, gravity is not doing him a big service because it's putting tension into the spine. So that's the reason why you want the sacrum to turn. Because once the sacrum gets beyond 90 degrees, gravity starts to work in your favor.
Great.
So like from where Allison, our friends on our first slide where there were 3 together, from where they are to where Aiden is, it's just slightly tilted, is a really big difference. Because sure, if Aiden pulled on his feet really hard or did what you said, like bounced up and down, that would still be violent towards the spine.
Right.
But just in using passive gravity here, he's not in the same kind of precarious position as the others are. So basically, for instance, our friend on the left here, he needs to lay down and stretch his hamstrings with a strap.
Yeah.
And do folk, or he could stand at a wall and have his hands high up the wall and work on pelvic rotation, but something where he's supported so he can relax while he works on those parts that need to open.
Right, because otherwise he might be doing a standing forward bend like we're seeing here, and it logically seems like the best practice to open your hamstrings. But what he might do, we don't know this, but he might just end up loading his spine and putting a whole bunch of undue pressure on somewhere along his lower back. Is that right?
Exactly.
And if he simply lays down on the floor,
he probably isn't going to get any more flexible.
right?
So he's going to get super frustrated.
Super frustrated, right?
He's going to be like, why am I doing this every day? It hurts really bad.
Yeah.
And I don't enjoy it, and nothing's happening. So it's not going to be effective either.
Yeah.
But just to sum it up here, is that some people are going to need more mobility. Like this friend here, he needs more mobility. But our other friend, Dina, she needs more stability.
Sure.
So both an excess of mobility or stability can cause discomfort.
Sure.
So you can't just look at the shape to decide, or decide that flexibility is better than stiffness.
Yeah. Well, great. And then I'm looking at descending angle at the pelvis, just another forward bend example.
Right. So she's got even more of a descending angle than Aiden did.
Mm.
So just showing that. And then go ahead to the next slide. Since
To bend or not to bend.
Right. So you can see here in the line that just from her bending her knees, her tilt becomes more complete.
Mm.
I wouldn't say that for her it would be like it's terrible for her to do this with straight legs, but because of her standing posture where she's so hinged forward at the hips, I'd really recommend that she brought her hands up on blocks and tried to lengthen her spine as she lengthened her legs.
Sure.
Of course, every single posture has a function, so what you get out of it with your legs straight is different than what you get out of it with your legs bent. The question is what you're getting out of it really worth it in terms of what you're gaining?
Yeah.
So I would say that maybe the gain for her, maybe it's about even with her legs straight and her legs bent.
Sure.
But for the other folks, I would say that it was better for them to do it with their legs bent. And even Dina, I would work with a slight bend in the knees because that's going to give her some tensile hamstring strength.
Right.
Which I bet her hamstrings are not very strong.
Yeah.
Which is a big problem with yoga practitioners.
Long, weak hamstrings, right?
Yeah, and why people get hamstring attachment injuries and stuff.
Mm. Well, great. Well, this has been, I mean, I've learned a whole bunch of stuff just watching this, and I just want to go take some pictures of myself sideways in the mirror to take a look at my back, and I'm sure everybody feels the same way. I see we've got dozens and dozens of questions here. Like I mentioned, we took a couple of them. I knew we weren't going to have time for all of them, so what I'm going to do is if you've posted a question in there, we'll get back to you personally. We will for sure get back to you. So again, sorry we couldn't get to all of these. I know Kimberly has an appointment here, and she's been kind enough to lend us an hour of her time with her voice almost gone. So in terms of next steps here, like we talked about in the beginning, just forget about perfect posture and just focus on moving toward balance, whatever that means for you. Your spine is probably never going to look perfectly stacked, but you can move toward balance, and even more importantly is you can find balance in whatever you're doing, whether it's running or yoga or tennis or whatever it is. And yoga is not a cure-all. It's not something that's going to get rid of cancer or make back pain disappear, but it's pretty darn effective. And if you're looking at correcting imbalances, the things that cause back and neck pain, the things that cause chronic injury, and if you're looking at creating a balanced body for life, there's really not any activity that comes even close to yoga. Almost all physical exercise activities create imbalances, and yoga is specifically designed to move towards balance. So that's one of the reasons why I get really excited about it. So before we wrap up, I just want to talk about our 5-week workshop, which is coming up. We're going to have weekly online classes just like the one you just did. We're going to have a 24-hour, 7 days a week members forum. It's going to be moderated by Kimberly and by myself, so you can ask specific questions and get specific answers to your situation, whether you're dealing with an injury, whether you're a teacher, whether you've never done yoga in your whole life. Everyone's welcome. During the course, you're going to get 5 unique 15-minute back and neck care series. You'll get those on video, you'll get those on audio, you'll have color pose charts. All of this you'll be able to use at home forever. The idea is, again, once you identify some things you need to work on in your spine, you can start working on it at home. You don't have to quit doing whatever else you're doing. If you love golf, if you love tennis, if you have a really athletic yoga practice, you just want to work towards a more balanced place, you can use these 15-minute per day series to really make some lasting changes, and it doesn't have to be a huge time drain. So we're going to have live call-in days just like this with Kimberly and myself. We're going to give a whole bunch of personal attention. We're going to have surprise guest lectures and also bonus trainings. And all this is going to cost less than one session with Kimberly. Her normal rates are very high. I pay her a lot of money to come to our courses. So if you want to get on the early notification list, you just go to the page, which is yogabodynaturals.com/backcare. yogabodynaturals.com/backcare if you want to get on the early notify list. Basically what happened is Kimberly and I were creating this program just because we were really excited about it. We had no idea there was going to be so much interest. At this point, we have over 1,000 people who are registered early, and we can't even take a fraction of that number. So if you are interested, go to yogabodynaturals.com/backcare. If you're even thinking maybe, just go there, sign up, so as soon as we open it, you can at least consider it, because it will fill up very quickly. We're going to give a lot of personalized attention, and we're going to be working one-on-one in the forum, and it's a big course, it's a long course, and it's very, very inexpensive, so it'll fill up very quickly. And we'd love to help you all, but we're not going to be able to. So, again, thanks so much for joining us. Kimberly, did you have any closing thoughts before we wrap up?
I just wanted to say thanks again for everyone who sent in their pictures, and I find it just amazing how much can be done just through the pictures. So I imagine that in our forum, people will be able to send in their pictures so that I can help them out and give them not only these practices that we'll have, but also specific suggestions. And I'm just really excited about this potential, because it's pretty awesome what you can see. You know, I spend a lot of time looking at bodies in my life, and I think it's incredible what you can see through pictures, and what you can see on camera these days. I'm kind of old school in terms of like the teacher-student relationship and wanting to meet people and know them in person and everything, which is, you know, still probably my first preference, but this is definitely the next best thing. It's awesome.
Well, great. So for everyone listening, thanks so much. Again, this has been Lucas Rockwood and Kimberly Johnson, and this has been the How's Your Spine Doing webinar, and this is kind of a preview call for this class we have coming up. And to learn more about that, go to yogabodynaturals.com/backcare. Hope you learned a whole bunch from this. We've got a bunch of questions. Like I said, I will be answering these shortly here today, and we'll also send you out the replay, including the notes and the video, so you can watch this at your convenience. Thanks so much for joining us, Kimberly, and thanks everybody, and goodbye for now.